A session on monetary policy transmission. We'll start with Oleksandr Faryna. He is a leading specialist in the research unit of the Monetary Policy and Economic Analysis Department at the National Bank of Ukraine. He will talk about the exchange rate pass-through, and his talk will be based on evidence from Ukraine and Russia. The floor is yours.
Thank you for introduction. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here and to talk about one of the most urgent issues in Ukraine, the relationship between prices, consumer prices, and exchange rates. Part of this work that I'm going to present today has been carried out within the visiting research program at the Banks of Finland Institute of Economists in Transition. And I'm glad that the head of the BOFIT is present here today, and he joined us for this conference, and I have a chance to express my gratitude for useful suggestions. Although I would like to thank two reviewers who had made a good contribution to improve our paper. Let me first start with the motivation behind this research and highlight the importance of exchange rate pass-through mechanism for the monetary policy in Ukraine. The efficiency of a new direction in Ukrainian monetary policy and ability of the central bank to attain its inflation targets requires a thorough understanding of the extent to which prices actually respond to exchange rate movements. In fact, the adoption of the IT and transition to flexible exchange rate policy in a small open economy may be problematic if the risks associated with exchange rate volatility remain high. In the case of Ukraine, this issue has been warmed up by several factors. In instance, uncertainties due to the military conflict and also trade restrictions with Russia. Given the particular importance of exchange rate pass-through, the literature that studies this issue for Ukraine is scarce. Actually, there are several studies, comprehensive studies, that provide empirical estimates for Ukraine, but they all utilize, and the time span of their analysis actually captures the period of exchange rate peg to the US dollar, which was used to provide a nominal anchor for the economy. But lots of things changed, and I believe that most of you here are aware of recent developments of Ukrainian economy. Let me have a closer look on what happened for the last years with consumer prices and exchange rates in Ukraine. From the beginning of 2014, Ukraine has experienced a rapid depreciation, which was mainly caused by several factors, such as dramatic shifts in risk premium, adjustments to balance of payment mismatches, and also unfavorable terms of international trade. This all aggravated macroeconomic turbulences and resulted eventually in a peak inflation up to 60%. From the second half of 2015 until present days, in the climate of gradual economic stabilization and floating exchange rate regime, hryvnia depreciated by around 20%, and in contrast to last periods, it was mainly due to the drop in commodity world prices and imposed restrictions with Russia. In this case, the decrease of prices for commodities had actually both direct, positive as well as negative effect on the price level. And this eventually resulted in a relatively modest price adjustment. For this short period of exchange rate flexibility, we can notice that the degree of a pass-through effect may depend on various factors. And studying these factors actually can shed the light on how we should react on such shocks in various conditions. Since the breakdown of a Bretton Woods system and the adoption of flexible exchange rates by many economies, the issue of exchange rate pass-through has become a trend in research topic in empirical as well as theoretical literature. Drawing on existing studies, exchange rate pass-through can have both direct and indirect effect on the consumer price level of the country. The direct effect implies that following the depreciation of the currency of exchange rate, prices of finished goods prices of finished goods that are actually imported to the country become more expensive because of the reduced purchasing power of the domestic currency. In addition, prices of imported inputs that are used in domestic production of goods also become more expensive. This increases the production cost for producers, and they actually can pass through this higher cost to consumers by rising prices. And the literature which studies the import price responsiveness is extensive and usually follows the pricing to market theory or considers currency pricing strategy of exporting firm. But on the other hand, the exchange rate pass-through can have also indirect effect on consumer prices through changes in the composition of demand and in levels of aggregate demand and wages. In this respect, following the depreciation of the currency, demand for imported goods increased both abroad and home. And higher prices for imported goods increase the demand for labor, and thus rises wages, which in turn can be also reflected in the domestic price level. In order to capture both direct and indirect effects, empirical literature usually follows the approach of direct effect analysis and then adapts it so that it is suitable to estimate the aggregate response of domestic price level. All of these studies, however, assume that countries are small open economies, and in this respect, domestic prices of each country are affected by external shocks only through a single direction, treating countries as isolated islands. But where do the shocks come from? The nature of such shocks and the possibility of their transmission to other countries is usually neglected in the literature. But there is a growing evidence that in the new global order with international interdependencies, cross-country spillovers can no more be treated in isolation, and the multilateral perspective is crucial. Following this idea, we raise the question where cross-country spillovers can actually be an additional determinant and shed the light on what is the degree of price responsiveness to exchange rate fluctuations. Let me describe this logic with a simple example. Think of the two countries A and B, which have different currencies and which are linked together through the trade channel. Namely, country A imports and exports goods to country B and vice versa. As mentioned previously, following the depreciation of currency A with respect to currency B, domestic prices in A should rise through direct as well as indirect transmission channel. Meanwhile, from the perspective of the other country, the price level in B decreases due to the same mechanism. And this implies that import prices in foreign currency for A and B also change, which in turn affect domestic price level and compensate the effect of exchange rate movements. If we believe in the law of one price, this should actually equalize prices in both countries, but the degree of exchange rate pass-through does not necessarily equals to 1. In addition, if countries A and B are linked together through common foreign markets, they both export substitute goods to the rest of the world. Following the depreciation in one country, the currency of the other may experience additional pressure as the foreign demand for its goods actually declines. For this reason, cross-country spillovers due to the trade linkage as well as exchange rate interdependencies might be a sufficient determinant of the pass-through effect, and failure to observe this aspect of reality may induce distortions to our analysis. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia might be a good example to explore this issue practically. Being open economies, both countries are sensitive to external shocks, and especially to exchange rate and commodity price shocks. Historical and geographical conditions explain a tight linkage between Ukraine and Russia through trade, credit, and many other different channels. On the one hand, Russia has a considerable weight in the import structure of the energy import-dependent Ukraine. And at the same time, Russia is one of the major exporting markets for Ukraine. And given this fact, external shocks from Russia may affect Ukrainian prices through already described channels. But on the other hand, Ukraine doesn't seem to be a major trading partner with Russia. Ukrainian weight in Russian imports does not exceed 3%, which means that probably Ukrainian Ukrainian shocks does not necessarily affect Russian prices. However, due to the fact that both countries have common foreign markets and they actually export substitute goods, it can also follow that currency depreciation of one currency can make additional pressure on the other. One way to study economic interdependencies and cross-country spillovers is to use a panel VAR framework. Although the multilateral perspective of the analysis gives a floor of implication of panel VARs in various areas, allowing for cross-sectional interdependencies in the model, however, adds complexity to the identification of structural shocks and induces dimensionality problems, as the number of coefficients to be estimated can easily exceed the number of observations taken for the analysis. But the alternative approach is the two-country VARs, which narrows the analysis to the bilateral perspective. This helps to avoid the dimensionality problem and facilitates the interpretation of results while allowing for three main characteristic features of panel VARs. The first one, endogenous representation of the model, implies that all variables of all units enter the equation of each variable for each unit, which this is called dynamic interdependencies. In addition, reduced form residuals are generally correlated between units, across units, which means static interdependencies. And lastly, allowing for unit-specific intercept and variance of shocks implies cross-sectional heterogeneity. Bilateral VARs has been widely used in the literature to study the transmission of monetary and fiscal shocks across countries. A number of studies use two-country VARs, which only consider the spillover sender and spillover recipient. For example, studying the impact of US monetary policy shocks on the other countries. Another set of papers has used the bilateral models allowing for interdependencies, all kinds of interdependencies. In order to address the issue of Ukrainian and Russian domestic price responsiveness to exchange rate movements and taking into account these potential spillover effects that we already mentioned, we employ a two-country VAR approach, allowing for all three characteristic features of the model. In particular, we run two bilateral VAR models. The first one is used to reflect the trade linkage between Ukraine and Russia and estimate the degree to which core consumer prices respond to changes in the nominal exchange rate of ruble with respect to hryvnia. We also use industrial production indices in this case, which can reflect the demand conditions in both countries. In addition, we take fuel price index taken from IMF statistics, which includes Brent oil, natural gas, and coal prices, in order to allow for some supply shocks in the model. For the comparison purposes, we also run individual VARs, where countries are treated in isolation in order to identify the sufficiency of potential spillover effects. In this case, foreign prices of each country, Russian prices for Ukraine and Ukrainian prices for Russia, they are taken as exogenous variables and spillover effects are neglected. In addition to the first model, we run the second one in order to account for potential exchange rate interdependencies between Ukraine and Russia in their common foreign markets. This model includes hryvnia and ruble exchange rate with respect to US dollar. And in this case, we also use consumer prices, consumer price index in OECD economies in order to account for effects of foreign prices. Our analysis is based on the monthly data from January 2000 until the end of 2015, which is relatively enough in order to avoid dimensionality problems. And dealing with cross-sectional residual correlation, we follow the recursive VAR framework. And while estimating impulse response functions, we put Russian variables first in the Cholesky ordering, so they are affected. So the shocks affect the Ukrainian variables in the first time period, and then just Russian. Here you can see the result that we've got from the first model. The graphs show the cumulative dynamic exchange rate pass-through coefficients, which represent the response of prices, of core consumer prices in Ukraine and Russia to 1% depreciation of ruble with respect to hryvnia. Results suggest that the pass-through coefficient in Russia does not change significantly. In both cases, it's 0.1. But on the contrary, important spillovers can be easily identified for Ukraine. In particular, ruble depreciation, the pass-through effect from ruble depreciation changes its direction and resulting in increasing Ukrainian prices instead of decreasing it as suggested by individual VAR analysis. Let me try to trace these dynamics through the diagram you've already seen before. In the short run, the response of Ukrainian prices to hryvnia appreciation is similar to one from individual VAR, as it decreases the price of imported goods denominated in local currency and eventually passes through to the aggregate consumer price level. At the same time, ruble depreciation increases Russian prices through the same mechanism. The rising prices in Russia spill back as a foreign price for Ukraine, increasing it and eventually changes the effect of a pass-through. Yeah. And this in turn the change in foreign price for Russia instead has a modest effect, which stabilizes the exchange rate pass-through coefficient in the long run. Here you can see that, this diagram helps to us, and this model helps us to identify the important spillovers due to the trade linkage between two countries. The next slide shows the results from the second model, which was built to capture exchange rate interdependencies. In this case, we can see that hryvnia depreciation with respect to US dollar has a modest effect in Russia. At the same time, the effect in Ukraine is about 0.3. However, Russian prices respond to ruble depreciation by 0.2. And in Ukraine, as you can see, this results in an even larger pass-through effect than from hryvnia depreciation. In this respect, we should be aware that potential cross-country spillovers due to this exchange rate interdependencies can arise in the case of Ukraine, but they are not sufficient in the case of Russia. In order to conclude, the main idea of this research actually is to encourage debates on the importance of potential cross-country spillovers in exchange rate pass-through mechanism for domestic prices. Taking Ukraine and Russia as an example, we provide some evidence that these spillover effects actually exist and are sufficient in the case of Ukraine. In this respect, National Bank of Ukraine, while making decisions in attaining inflation targets, should be aware of the impact of Russian economy on Ukrainian consumer prices. And in our analysis, we provide also a series of robustness checks, which are reflected in the paper. But in the further research that we plan to do, we are going to extend the analysis to the multilateral framework in order to account for some higher order transmission channels. So that is all that I have for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions.
We have time for a few questions.
Hi, have you tried other countries? I mean, Poland?
Well, not yet, but as I already said, that we plan to extend the analysis and include many other countries, for example, in the global VAR, in order to trace these effects from other countries, because the bilateral perspective does not allow us to capture some effects, for example, from US or Euro area or Asia or anything. So this is actually what we are going to do in the future.
Well, it's a great research, but it seems like the goal of NBU is to stabilize Russian prices first.
Well, actually, this question might be very important for the National Bank, because although due to the trade restrictions with Russia, it seems that we should become less dependent on the Russian economy, yeah? But the fact that our exchange rates are interdependent in the world, it makes us more sensitive to Russia, even if we just stop trade between them.
Probably it just makes sense to do research against the trade partners, to compare it to see how much inflation and how much the volatility from exchange rates we just import or export.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think there are lots of issues that should be involved in the analysis. For example, some possible asymmetries, because here the linear representation of the model implies that everything equals. Yeah, appreciation is the same as depreciation. So I think that the future the research can include different issues, including that you mentioned already.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then we move on to the next speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Bartosz Maćkowiak from the, he's a senior economist at the Monetary Policy Research Division of at the ECB, and he is also a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. He holds a PhD from Yale University. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. This is a joint paper with my colleague Monetary-fiscal, and let me emphasize the views expressed here are only ours. They do not reflect the views of the ECB. This is a paper about the role of monetary and fiscal policy in business cycle stabilization, with a focus on the euro area. We have a couple of motivating questions. What's the relation between how monetary and fiscal policy interact in the euro area and the recent macroeconomic outcomes? The recent macro outcomes have not been good. Real GDP per capita last year was 2% lower than 7 years before, in 2008. This is real GDP per capita for the euro area as a whole. Since 2009, inflation has been very low. The ECB's policy rates have been close to the lower bound. And finally, government bond spreads, which you can think of as just the difference between interest rates on government bonds of individual member states compared with government bonds of Germany. They used to be about 0 until 2009, and then they increased sharply and then decreased again to low levels. So that's what's been happening. Given that what's been happening is not so good, we also want to ask the second question: what kind of interaction between monetary and fiscal policy would have improved the macroeconomic outcomes? Specifically in the paper, we formalized the idea that the way monetary and fiscal policy currently interact in the euro area has actually been central to the recent outcomes. We do this by solving a simple, nonlinear general equilibrium model with sticky prices. We're going to make assumptions about monetary and fiscal policy in the model that we think capture the essentials of how these policies are actually conducted in the euro area. And given that, we'll show the model reproduces the main features of the recent data. Now that result is going to make us confident about using the model for a policy experiment in the second part of the paper. And there, in a policy experiment, we're going to imagine monetary and fiscal policy interact differently than they actually do, and we're going to ask what would have happened. And we show the macroeconomic outcomes since 2009 would have been much improved. That alternative configuration that we will imagine will involve a non-defaultable Eurobond, and I'll explain what I mean. Okay, so that's the outline. Let's go to the model. It's very simple. Think of your standard 3-equation new Keynesian model. There is a single economy. There are homogeneous households and firms. And the only change we're going to introduce is we're going to think of each homogeneous household as paying lump sum taxes to n fiscal authorities instead of just one fiscal authority. And for simplicity, think of capital N as equal to 2, north and south. So think of each household as a European family. It consumes the euro area common consumption basket of goods, supplies labors to firms throughout the euro area. And the only peculiar thing about the economy is that the household pays taxes to 2 separate fiscal authorities. There is a single monetary authority, follows a standard Taylor rule that makes the policy rate respond to inflation. It's subject to the lower bound, so the policy interest rate cannot decrease below some effective lower bound. Each of these 2 fiscal authorities issues 1-period nominal bonds. They follow, each of them follows a standard rule for setting the primary budget surplus that makes the primary budget surplus respond to the stock of public debt, but also respond positively to output. So as output goes up, the budget tends to improve. One other particular feature of this economy that's not usually in macro models, but we think it's important for thinking about fiscal policy in the euro area, is that it's possible that each of these fiscal authorities may default. I really mean here orderly debt restructuring, not something disorderly, but may not be able to honor its public debt fully. And in particular, we will just have a rule that determines when that default happens. The default will happen when public debt will exceed some upper bound. And there's uncertainty in the economy about what that upper bound is. Okay, the upper bound is an IID random variable. So people who hold government bonds, they know default may happen in the future, but they're uncertain exactly when or at what level of government debt. So we think this is a very simple model, but we think that it captures the essential features of how monetary and fiscal policy interact in the euro area. There is the ECB setting the policy interest rate subject to the lower bound. That's been a very relevant consideration recently, the fact that the lower bound is there. And there are fiscal authorities separate that issue debt that may be restructured. Okay, let's now start analyzing the model, and I want to emphasize we analyze the full nonlinear version of this model without any approximation. This model has 2 steady states, so there are 2 solutions of the model along which all variables are constant over time. One is what I'm going to call the intended steady state. That's a solution for which the inflation rate is equal to the central bank's objective. However, unfortunately, there is another steady state at which inflation is below the central bank's objective permanently, and the policy interest rate is at the lower bound. Furthermore, when you think about shocks hitting the economy, so the first bullet point describes what I call non-stochastic steady states, so solutions to the model when there are no shocks hitting the economy. Now imagine a disturbance hitting the economy at the time when the global financial crisis happened that raises the value of future consumption relative to current consumption, makes people relatively more patient. This model is going to say that there are many solutions for output, inflation, and the policy interest rate. That's the y, pi, and r variables after that disturbance happens. So the response to the economy to the disturbance is indeterminate. In particular, there's one solution that converges to the intended steady state, but there are infinitely many other solutions that converge to the unintended steady state. And there's really nothing that given how we've set up how policy operates in this economy, there is nothing policy can do about this. Furthermore, there are also multiple solutions for the interest rate on government debt. So if investors are optimistic that there's not going to be default, the interest rate on government debt is low, government debt is low, and therefore the probability of default is low, validating the investor's expectation. On the other hand, if investors get pessimistic, the bond yields go up, public debt goes up, the probability of default goes up, and that expectation can also be validated. So we think that's an important insight about the euro area economy. It's a land of indeterminacy. So now we want to solve this model. We want to solve for the impulse response function to the disturbance that we think happened in 2009, a disturbance that raises the value of future consumption relative to current consumption. So we're going to introduce, to get a unique solution, we're going to introduce non-fundamental shocks, sunspot shocks, and their role is to let us solve for a unique solution. And then we'll compare that unique solution to the model to the data. So in particular, we assume two sunspot processes. The first one we call a confidence about inflation sunspot shock. That can occur with a given probability P each year. This is going to be an annual model. So long as the shock has not already occurred, after the shock has occurred, it's not going to occur again. The economy converges to the unintended steady state. The other sunspot shock, we call it a confidence about debt. That lets us pick a solution for the interest rate on debt of a given fiscal authority. And then we choose some parameter values for the model. We also, when we parameterize the fiscal side of the model, we think of north as being the aggregate of Germany, France, and the Netherlands, and we think of south as being the aggregate of Italy and Spain. So let me now show you how this impulse response to the shock looks like in the model, and we compare it to the euro area data. So here you have output and inflation in the upper row, the central bank's interest rate, and the government bond spread, the difference between the interest rate in north and the interest rate in south, or the other way around, the difference between the interest rate in south and the interest rate in north in the bottom row. The thin lines are data. The thick lines are the solution of the model. And the picture for inflation is actually two data series in it, one for HICP and the other one for core HICP. And the time span is between 2008 and 2015. So we imagine this economy is in the intended steady state in 2008. In 2009, the fundamental shock hits, and we trace out what happens. We think the model, keeping in mind that it's very simple, matches the main features of the euro area data. In particular, notice that the data follow this non-monotonic pattern. Each of the four variables follows a non-monotonic pattern. It first falls, then it rises, then it falls again. And the model matches that pattern qualitatively, that qualitative pattern. Furthermore, even quantitatively, the model is similar to the data. So this finding makes us confident that this model is helpful for understanding how the euro area works, and now we want to use the model for a policy experiment. So let me first talk about the motivation for the policy experiment and hopefully give you the intuition for how the policy experiment works, how it manages to improve the outcomes that I showed on the previous slide. So the central relation really that's present in any model with public debt is that the market value of public debt is equal to the present value of primary budget surpluses. Okay? Now, in reality and in this model, the primary surplus tends to fall in a recession. Right? The recession has a negative impact on a budget. Now, if public debt is defaultable, as it is in the euro area and in this baseline simulation, there are really two possibilities. One is the present value of primary surpluses actually does not change. So the primary surplus falls today, but people know in the future there's going to be fiscal consolidation. So the present value of primary surpluses actually stays constant. And therefore, the relation in the first bullet point remains satisfied. But if that's the case, in this very simple model, there is no wealth effect from this current fiscal accommodation, from the fact that the primary surplus falls in the recession. People don't really feel wealthier although their taxes fall or their transfers rise, because they know this fiscal accommodation is going to be undone in the future. And let me emphasize, it's a very simple model, but in this model, there's no effect from this fiscal accommodation on output or inflation. The other possibility is people think maybe the present value of primary surpluses has fallen, but then what happens, what restores the relationship in the first bullet point, is that the probability of default rises. Government bond yields rise, and therefore the market value of public debt is equal again to the lower present value of primary surpluses. And again, in this simple model, there's no wealth effect, because households hold government bonds here. When the present value of primary budget surpluses falls, their tax liabilities fall. That makes them feel richer, but they're also bondholders, and they're now making a capital loss on their bonds due to the expectations of default, and these two effects just cancel each other, so there's no wealth effect on households. However, normally, in most economies, there is another possibility, and that is that if public debt is denominated in a fiat currency, monetary and fiscal policy can coordinate to make that debt non-defaultable. So if public debt promises fiat currency, fiat currency is really something that the state, the government acting, the monetary and fiscal authority acting together can always provide. As an analogy, think of reserve deposits at the central bank, or remunerated reserve deposits. These are essentially non-defaultable because the central bank can always honor them by providing currency. And you could do an analogous operation for debt of fiscal authority. And then if that's the case, if we imagine that there is that public debt is non-defaultable, there is another possibility for this relationship in the first bullet point to hold, and that is you can actually lower the present value of primary surpluses. So you can, as you enter the recession, the primary surplus falls, you can actually say that is not going to be undone in the future, or at least it's not going to be fully undone in the future. And then in this model, as the present value of primary surpluses falls, households feel wealthier at the current price level because their bond holdings, because the present value of primary surpluses has fallen relative to the real value of their bond holdings at the current price level. They increase spending. That tends to stimulate demand and also increase prices. And through that channel, the real value of government debt falls eventually and restores this relationship in the first bullet point. But this is valuable if you start in a recession when output is too low and inflation is too low. It helps you stabilize the economy. It helps you increase inflation and increase output. But that tool has been given up by the member states when they created the euro, because no fiscal authority in the euro area can issue non-defaultable public debt. So what we want to do in the policy experiment, we want to imagine that there is one fiscal authority that in the euro area that can issue non-defaultable debt. You can think of that fiscal authority as similar to the European Stability Mechanism. We're going to just refer to it as the fund. And we're going to continue to maintain that the member states, the individual member states, continue issuing public debt that is defaultable. So this fund is the only agent that's arranged with the ECB that its debt issued as part of concerted policy intervention with the ECB is always going to be redeemed at maturity at par value. So let me now talk about the details of the policy experiment. So we're imagining there's this centrally operating fund. It's issuing non-defaultable Eurobonds. It's standing ready to purchase in the primary market debt of individual national fiscal authorities, so long as these fiscal authorities follow a prescribed rule. Now, what is that rule? That rule is standard in normal times when the economy is performing well. But when the economy is not performing well, in particular when we hit the lower bound, when the gross policy interest rate is equal to 1, each national fiscal authority is expected to switch to this reaction function for the primary surplus. On the left-hand side, it's the primary budget surplus. Then there is a constant term. The last term at the end is feedback from the output gap. And the term in the middle is an innovation here. And the term in the middle is saying that each country is expected to raise its primary surplus only to the extent that its public debt is growing faster than the total stock of public debt in the euro area as a whole. So if you got hit relatively worse by a shock, your public debt is growing faster than the average, you're supposed to raise your primary surplus. But if you've been treated better by the shock, so your public debt is actually growing more slowly than the average, you're supposed to lower your primary surplus. Okay? It turns out this rule, when countries follow this rule, this model has a unique equilibrium, and it's also possible to implement an accommodative fiscal policy response to a contractionary shock. We're also assuming that when this contractionary shock hits and the policy rates hit the lower bound, the monetary authority switches to setting an exogenous path for the policy rate converging to the intended steady state. This is known as an example. This is an example of what's known as passive monetary policy. It doesn't really matter we specify this particular form of passive monetary policy. It's just important that there be some kind of passive monetary policy implemented. So let's suppose that each fiscal authority follows this rule, and the fund is there standing ready to buy the debt of each national fiscal authority. If that had happened, the outcome since 2009 would have been much better. And now I'm just comparing the data. I'm comparing now the baseline simulation, that's the thin line, so the solution, the old solution of the model, with a policy experiment, the thick line. So you can see output and inflation would have been essentially stabilized, and also there would have been no government default premia. Now, of course, it may be naive to think that each national fiscal authority would have, in fact, followed that prescribed fiscal rule. So it's important to ask what would have happened if a country deviated from the prescribed fiscal rule. Now, we think that the fund should then have the obligation to say that if a country is deviating from its fiscal rule, it's no longer going to buy or stand ready to buy its national public debt. The country would then be on its own, it would have to borrow only from private creditors if it wanted to borrow at all, and we think it could then resort to debt restructuring. Now, we can use the model to assess the effects of debt restructuring, and we pick South as one of the two countries in the model that restructure its debt. The main effect of debt restructuring in the model is that the stream of real resources that are flowing to the fund decreases, okay, if there is debt restructuring. And what happens is there's extra inflation. And we can compute how much extra inflation there is. We find that for reasonable specifications, the magnitude of extra inflation is quite modest. So for example, with a recovery rate of 60%, inflation jumps to 2.8% at an annual rate. And furthermore, extra inflation can be eliminated completely if the fund can tax. And in particular, we consider the possibility that the fund could impose a small uniform tax on all member states in the euro area, something like a VAT surcharge. We only have lump sum taxes in the model, so we don't quite implement this, but that's the idea we have in mind. And that can eliminate, then the fund can recoup its capital loss from default, and therefore there would be no extra inflation. Let me just say a couple of things about why the magnitude of extra inflation is small. There are two reasons. One is the fund holds government bonds of all member states. So this includes North and South. And actually, because North is bigger than South, the fund holds more northern bonds than southern bonds. So, so that means that even if there is a haircut of 50% on South bonds, the actual capital loss, the actual haircut on the fund is something like 20%. And the other reason is that prices in the model are sticky, and as is realistic as we need to match the data. So let me conclude. The current configuration of monetary and fiscal policy has been central to the recent macro outcomes in the euro area. An alternative configuration could have led to much improved outcomes. The ability to issue non-defaultable public debt is valuable when the central bank's policy rates are at the lower bound, and therefore monetary policy has a very limited ability to stimulate the economy. There is a need for fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. Let me say a few more lessons more specific for the euro area. We think this model shows that the status quo in the euro area is very suboptimal, that the macroeconomic stabilization policy currently available is very suboptimal. We think it's possible to imagine a quid pro quo in which each member state loses some sovereignty in selected areas while gaining it in others, and that might be politically acceptable. So what we mean specifically is, of course, if we were to set up this fund, that would involve a loss of a degree of national sovereignty. However, the fund would really only need to define prescriptions for the primary budget surplus conditional on the state of the economy. It would not need to interfere at all with any details of fiscal policy or structural reforms in the member states. They could be left entirely to the member states. And that would represent a gain of sovereignty relative to the status quo. Finally, let me just remark that there is now one institution in the euro area that can issue non-defaultable debt. I've already alluded to it, reserve deposits. I mean the remunerated reserve deposits at the ECB. So therefore, it's actually possible that the ECB would act as the fund that we model. There are 2 points to be made. One is that therefore the kind of policy experiment that we consider could actually be implemented in a short run, with the ECB acting as the fund and the member states changing their fiscal policy. Now that's good, but the second point is not so good. We think in the medium and long run, the ECB should not be acting as the fund. There really should be a separate institution, because it would have the power to tax, and it would need the democratic legitimacy to make decisions about fiscal policy that the ECB does not have. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. So we have a few minutes for questions.
Bartosz, I was just curious, could you elaborate on how the model produces that non-monotonic path? Like, why is that? It seems like it's another shock, but it's not, because you just have one. Thanks.
No, it is. There are two shocks. In 2009, there's a fundamental shock, which is the shock that makes people more patient. And then I should have said that specifically in 2012, this sunspot confidence about inflation shock hits. And that's what's producing the second recession. Of course, in a richer model, you could think of that model as you could think of that sunspot as being correlated with some other variable like government spending, which we don't have in the model. Mm-hmm.
So this is really interesting. I really like the paper. One question I have is it a correct interpretation to think of these as sort of parallel economies that are hit with a common shock, and not really picking up the linkages between these economies? So in your opinion, is it because you think the spillovers aren't important, or is it just technically very difficult to solve with those linkages, or what's your view on that?
So we just decided, so literally what happens, it's a single economy with two fiscal authorities. So you pay, a representative household pays taxes into two separate pots. And these two fiscal authorities potentially follow different, behave differently. It's just the simplest way to handle this. Of course, you would like to have a richer model for some other questions, at least a two-country model where you can study spillovers between countries, but we haven't done that yet.
Yes, it's been very interesting. My question is about two things. The one thing is, how do you make sure that the fund can issue non-defaultable debt all the time, being, in a sense, emanation of the member states, right? And the second is, the problems we've had in the euro area were mostly caused by non-observing the rules by some countries. How do you make sure that they do observe the rules in this setup?
Yep. So what would need to happen is specifically for the ECB and the fund to agree that that debt issued by the fund as part of concerted policy intervention will be treated by the ECB in an equivalent way to the ECB's reserves. So this does not have to be automatic. The ECB could say no. It would remain an independent actor, but once that agreement has been reached, investors would know that when they're holding funds liabilities, it's like holding a reserve deposit at the ECB. Second, I don't think the countries would. So what we formally do in the paper, we specify rules that countries are supposed to follow, and we solve the model assuming they follow the rules. And then we also look at the situation where countries deviate from the rules, and and assuming that that leads to restructuring of national public debt. And in that case, all creditors, including the fund, suffer a capital loss. We actually don't think that countries would in reality always follow these rules. We think that countries might deviate, and therefore it's important that the fund has its own ability to tax. It could be very limited. It could be something like a VAT surcharge in all member states that provides the fund a cushion against capital losses from default. We don't think it's realistic that there would be some rules that countries would always follow.
Any more questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, then we move on to the next speaker. We have Alex Nikolsko-Rzhevskyy, who is an assistant professor at Lehigh University. He holds a PhD from the University of Houston, and he will address the old question of rules versus discretion in monetary policy.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the hosts for organizing this wonderful event. It's a pleasure to be here. And right now, this talk will continue talking about rules, but this time we'll talk about monetary policy rules and discretion as the opposite to rules. Most of the results presented in this paper is actually joint work with two of my co-authors from the University of Houston, David Papel and Oleksandr. And as you can see, we'll start talking about the Fed, and in particular the Taylor rule and application to the Fed, but then we'll move on to the discussion about the National Bank of Ukraine. So let's start. First of all, there are two opposite ways to conduct monetary policy. One of them is called using rules, another one is called using discretion. What is rules, what is discretion? Policy rules, an example of policy rule can be the Taylor 1993 rule, a very famous Taylor rule. It simply guidelines of how policy will respond to particular data, such as inflation or the output gap or unemployment. Policy rule doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a linear function, such as the Taylor rule, but it has to be a strict set of guidelines. Say inflation goes up, the interest rate goes up by more than the rise in inflation. Complete opposite to rules is discretion. And as of today, discretion is used by the Fed, discretion is used largely by the National Bank of Ukraine. What's discretion? Discretion makes absolutely no commitment to future policy actions, and policymakers at each point in time, they simply do what they think is best at that particular situation. Before we proceed, a very important question. Is inflation targeting an example of a rule? And that's indeed important because we know that the Fed is using inflation targeting, and we know that the National Bank of Ukraine started to target inflation. My answer is no. Inflation targeting is not an example of a rule. You can think of inflation target as being the final destination, the goal. This is where the economy should end up at eventually. And a policy rule is actually the path that will lead to that final outcome, final goal. Inflation targeting alone doesn't answer many important questions. For example, it doesn't specify which instrument or instruments should be used to conduct monetary policy. It doesn't specify how particular instruments should respond to various developments in the economy. Then you can think of, you can think that yes, a successful monetary policy will be able to stabilize inflation, or it will be able to bring inflation down when central bank is starting disinflation, right, like in the case of Ukraine. However, inflation target doesn't specify which policy in particular should be used to achieve that. There are usually many options, but one of them is better than the other. Inflation target alone doesn't answer either of those questions. So, what are the pros and cons of rules versus discretion? Which of the two is better? Of course, since we have a choice, we have these two options. None of them is perfect. Let's start with the advantages of rules. First of all, the big advantage of rules is that if a central bank is using rules, that increases transparency. It makes very clear for financial markets what central bank is doing, where central bank is going, and what central bank is planning to do in each particular set of circumstances. And many large players like PricewaterhouseCoopers already use Taylor rules to explain to their clients what the central bank is doing and what they should expect to happen in the future. Another big advantage of using rules is that policy rules solve the time inconsistency problems and they eliminate political business cycles. Political business cycle is a problem for developed economies such as the United States. Those business cycles are present there. And for developing countries, that should be an even bigger issue, right? But I think the biggest advantage of using rules versus using discretion is that rules set long-run expectations, so they affect long-term interest rates through the term structure models. And therefore, the impact of policy rules on the economy are much larger than the impact of any small one-time deviations in the short-term interest rates, since it's the long-term interest rates that actually matter for long-run prospects, for investment decisions, etc. Those are the advantages of rules. What is the disadvantages of rules? The disadvantages of rules are essentially the advantages of using discretion. So, first of all, discretion can incorporate a much wider array of information than rules. Second, picking the true rule or the best rule is not that easy because no one knows what the correct mode of the economy is. And finally, big advantage of discretion versus rules is that discretion is, in a sense, immune to changes in the economy. Yes, you might be able to have the right mode of the economy, you might be able to pick the best possible rule, but chances are, and that's famous Lucas critique, that relation between variables will change next year and 2 years, and therefore the rule that was optimal before will stop being optimal today, and you have to pick another rule. And picking another rule is not that different from exercising discretion in the first place. So now we have rules, now we have discretion. Both of them have advantages, disadvantages. Which of the two is better? Okay, it's working. Let's start with some qualitative evidence on rules and discretion. First of all, as of today, the majority of central banks do use discretion. They do not use rules. However, we can clearly see a movement towards using rules. Just as 25 years ago, we saw a very clear movement towards using inflation targeting, and now it's a widely accepted idea. That's exactly what we see with regard to rules right now. The Fed, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, they regularly in their reports refer to tail-type rules. Moreover, the US Congress right now is considering a legislation, and if the legislation is passed, it will make the Fed to choose whichever rules they want, but after that, the Fed would have to set interest rates according to that rule. And that's the Federal Reserve Accountability and Transparency Act of 2014. The same trend is observed in developing countries. Again, if you look at Brazil, at Chile, at Mexico, all their central banks tend to use rules more and more in their discussions. If now we look at quantitative evidence, the results, well, we don't really have a lot of results. It appears that it's much easier to test one rule versus another rule than to test discretion versus rules. For example, if you go to pick rule A versus rule B, what you can do, you can come up with the GSG models, then you can test rule number 1 versus rule number 2 and pick the rules that stabilize this economy better. However, each time you try to test rule versus discretion, each time you try to model discretion mathematically, you turn it into a rule. That's why it's almost impossible to test rules versus discretion using a mathematical model. So you have to use econometrics. You have to use some other approach. And that other approach is the one we actually proposed in our 2015 paper. That approach is extremely simple. Here, what we do in the paper. Recall our goal is to test rules versus discretion. We look at the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. We know that the Fed has never used rules. So officially, the Fed has never used rules. However, from time to time, whatever the Fed was doing, whatever the federal funds rate the Fed was setting, was very close to what the Taylor rule, the 1993 Taylor rule, would have suggested. So what you can do, you can simply construct the distance between the two series, the actual federal funds rate and the federal funds rate suggested by the Taylor rule. During some times, the distance is very small. So you can think that whatever the Fed is doing, it corresponds well to what the rule would have suggested. At other times, the distance is very large. So when the distance is small, we call that the rules period or the rules errors. When the distance is very large, we said that at that point, at that time, the Fed is exercising discretion. Therefore, our next step, after we construct the series of deviations, the distance between the two series, we'll test the series for breaks. We'll split the series into errors, small deviations, large deviations, and only the last final step will be left. After we correctly date rules errors and deviations errors, all we'll have to do is to compare how the economy was doing when the Fed was implicitly following rules, 2 periods of when the Fed was exercising discretion. So the whole idea is extremely simple. We know that even though the idea is simple, each time you work with natural data, and especially if you do monetary policy analysis, you should be extremely careful. And the analysis that we conducted here involved as much rigor as possible. So first of all, we did take into account the lower bound for the federal funds rate, and the federal funds rate reached the lower bound in 2008. So from 2008 through 2015, we used what's called the shadow rate of Wu and Xie. Then we tried to cope with possible endogeneity, that switch monetary policy improves the economy, but improved economy might cause monetary policy to experience shifts again. So we tried to spread the two events in time, and we assumed from 4 to 8 quarter lag between monetary policy changes and changes in the economy. The next thing we did, we conducted all monetary policy analysis using real-time data. There's data available to monetary authorities at the times they were making their decisions. And we all know that that data is very different from the data we have right now. Right now we have revised data, which is improved which includes all the corrections and revisions, but that's not the data that monetary policy authorities used when they were making decisions. So each time we look at the change of the federal funds rate, we rely only on the data that were available at that point in time. We use these snapshots of the economy. Then we allow the equilibrium interest rate to vary. That's a big improvement over the classical Taylor rule in which the equilibrium interest rate is fixed 2%. And finally, we tried many different measures of the output gap. Essentially, we tried every single output gap that's usually used in the economy in this type of analysis. So we use this real-time data, and that's the distance between the actual funds rate and the prescribed rate. That's a simple plot. Our next step is to try to run this plot through an econometric model and divide it into large deviations and small deviations. So our goal is to divide it into subperiods. And there are several choices of models you can use. We use several of them, but one I want to talk about today is the Makarski model. Here we assume that these deviations, they switch between two states, low deviations and high deviations. And those switches occur following some market switching process. So there are two states, and the system switches between state 1 and state 2. Therefore, here's the left-hand side, D, is that blue series you saw on the previous slide. Mu here is that intercepts the constant terms that switches between the two states. Epsilon, the error term, we allow the variance of epsilon also to switch between two states. And our model is actually relatively more advanced than Hamilton's 1989 model, because here we do not restrict variance and mu to follow the same Markov process. So the state distribution for mu can be completely different from the state distribution for epsilon. What you do next, we estimate this model, so we allow the data to speak for themselves and to split the series into subperiods. And the results available on the next slide. All you need for this table is essentially the first row. In the first row, you see that mu takes on two values. Mu equals to about 0.8% in state 1 and about 2.5% in state 2. What does it mean? First of all, it means that there are two separate states of the economy. You can see that the standard errors are very small, and the two states are clearly different from each other. In state 1, the distance between the funds rate and the rate suggested by the Taylor rule is very small. It's less than 1%. So we call that the Taylor rule states. In state 2, the distance between the funds rate and the rate prescribed by the classical Taylor rule is very large, in excess of 2%. So we assume that in state 2, the Fed was not following a Taylor rule, the Fed was in fact exercising discretion. If now you want to look at how the state distribution looks like, well, you can see that on the next slide. Here, the shaded areas are the periods of discretion. That's when the Fed did not use the Taylor rule, and the unshaded white areas are the periods when the Fed was actually acted as if the Fed was following the 1993 Taylor rule. You can see that the Fed exercised discretion in the 70s, the Fed exercised discretion after 2001, but the Fed acted as if it was following the rule between 1986 through 2000. Okay, now we know the dates. Now we know this breakout. Now we know when the Fed was using discretion, when the Fed was following the rules. Only one last step is left. Now we need to compare economic performance during rules errors and during discretionary errors. So first of all, we need to define some measure, something that will allow us to see whether the economy is doing well or the economy is doing poorly. We know that the Fed has dual mandates. The Fed cares about prices, the Fed cares about unemployment. So it's quite natural to come up with a loss function which will look at both of those variables, inflation and unemployment. In general, we know that high inflation is bad, high unemployment is bad. So let's add them up together. That will be our loss function number 1. It actually has its own name, the Okun's misery index. Of course, high values of that loss function will mean that the economy is doing poorly. However, we also know that not all inflation is bad, not all employment is bad. What actually matters is how close inflation is to the target level, and deviations in either way will be considered bad for the economy. And the same is true about unemployment. Ideally, we would like the employment rate to be as natural rate of unemployment. If it's above that or below that, it's still bad. So our second and third proposed loss functions take that into account. So in the second loss function, we sum together the unemployment gap and the inflation gap, and in the loss function number 3, we sum the squares of the unemployment gap and the inflation gap into the loss function number 3. Let's now look at the results. Here in the first column, you see the average loss during the Taylor rule errors, during the times when the Fed was implicitly following the Taylor rule. And in the last column, you see again the average loss when the Fed was exercising discretion. What's very important here is that all green numbers are smaller than the red numbers. It means that whichever loss function we assume, number 1, number 2, and number 3, the economy was doing always better when the Fed was acted as the Taylor rule would have suggested. And each time the Fed exercised discretion, the economy was doing a lot worse in terms of those loss functions. So if now we want to sum up these results with the United States, we can say that, first of all, for the US, economic performance was stronger when the Fed was implicitly using the Taylor rule. And this result is extremely robust. It's robust to choice of the loss function, it's robust to different assumptions about the policy lag, it's robust to various measures of the output gap. Essentially, whatever we did, whatever we threw into the model, we always got that the loss function was lower during the times when the Fed was using rules compared to times when the Fed was using discretion. Of course, in all of that analysis, we compared the classical 1993 rule to discretion. And yes, we indeed obtained that the classical rule seems to work better than discretion. But does it mean that the classical rule is the best possible rule? The answer is no. The classical rule assumes equal response coefficient for the output gap, and for the inflation gap, those coefficients are 0.5 and 0.5. What we did next, we tried to look at other Taylor rules. We tried to see how a rule with a different set of coefficients would work compared to discretion. As the results can be seen on the next slide. This is very nice, it's for me, table. What you see here, every single value here is the loss during discretionary states or the loss over the rule state. The larger values here mean that the rule provides great advantages over using discretion. So green values are good, red values are bad. You can treat it as like a standard heat map. Along the horizontal axis, we have the output gap coefficient gamma, and it varies from 0.1 to 1. So the classical Taylor rule result would be gamma equals to 0.5. And along the vertical axis, we have the inflation coefficient. Again, here it varies from 0 to 1. And the classical Taylor rule coefficient is that the delta equals to 0.5. So the classical Taylor rule is right in the middle. The first striking result we see from this heat map is that, first of all rules that strongly respond to inflation, so all rules that are in the upper part of this table, they work a lot better than all the rules that are in the lower part of the table. That means that it's probably a good idea for central banks to very strongly respond to deviations of the inflation rate from the target. But the output gap coefficient doesn't really matter. As long as delta is large, you will have a very good and strong Taylor rule. These are our results for the United States. Now, what can we use for Ukraine? How can you transfer those results into the case of Ukraine? First of all, what do we know about Ukraine right now? Well, we know that the banking system right now is being reformed, is being cleaned and revitalized. We also know that the National Bank of Ukraine started to target inflation, and it appears to be a success. Last year, the inflation rate was 43%. This year, according to some sources, the inflation rate is already lower than the target level of inflation of 12%. So it looks like that whatever the National Bank of Ukraine is doing is working. Now, also we know that monetary policy was recently updated and simplified. It's much more transparent than it was in the past, and this conference is an example of that. However, there are still some challenges. First of all, if you look at survey data, it looks like that inflation expectations are not yet well anchored. Regardless of whether we look at households, we look at firms, we look at professional forecasters, they all seem to expect higher inflation rates than the actual inflation rate in Ukraine. And we know that these high inflation expectations, they actually create negative supply shocks, and that makes the central bank's job in controlling inflation, especially bringing inflation down, a lot harder. It increases actual inflation, it increases unemployment. Also, we know that there is a huge heterogeneity between regions. The east of Ukraine expects inflation that's very different from the west of Ukraine. And it appears that there is still some mistrust in the National Bank of Ukraine, and not everyone believes that the National Bank of Ukraine is capable of controlling inflation. What can be done? In my opinion, today, Ukraine, as the National Bank of Ukraine, can actually benefit if the National Bank of Ukraine adopts some sort of a rule, which is similar to the classical 1993 Taylor rule. What is the advantages of that? If the National Bank of Ukraine does adopt a rule, it will first of all increase credibility and transparency of monetary policy. It will help to anchor those inflation expectations, and that's why it will make the conduct of monetary policy a lot easier. It will reduce political pressure on the NBU. And it will set forward expectations and simplify investment decisions. I want to stress that adopting a rule does not mean that the NBU will become obsolete and the conduct of monetary policy will become mechanical, that someone, an intern, can just plug two numbers in the Taylor rule and get the lending rate as a result of that. Absolutely not. It doesn't mean that that rule will have to be used to conduct monetary policy, but that rule will have to be used as a reference point. So the National Bank of Ukraine will have to do its best to use that rule and set the lending rate according to that rule. But of course, from time to time, deviations from the rule will be warranted. And at that time, the representative of the National Bank of Ukraine, I assume Ms. Hontcheva, we will have to explain why a particular deviation has occurred. How do we pick the best rule for Ukraine? First of all, ideally, we of course would like to conduct the sort of analysis I showed you for the United States. But unfortunately, for Ukraine, it's not possible due to the lack of data. We started to float only recently. So we simply don't have enough data for that sort of analysis. Nevertheless, good Taylor rule can still be chosen based on prior research. In fact, any rule that satisfies like basic monetary policy requirements should work quite well, also for the case of Ukraine. What do we know about rules that work well for developing economies, for small open economies? When it comes to the choice of the policy variables, the left-hand side variable in the rule, the choice is usually dictated by the economic conditions within a country. Usually we think that if inflation is high, if there is uncertainty about net exports and investment, if there is uncertainty about the real interest rate and the equilibrium level of the interest rate, the best choice for the policy variable is some monetary aggregate. I think that's where Ukraine was in 2014, 2015. Right now, we are for the most part past that. In more stable environment, the best policy variable is a short-term lending rate. And I'm happy to see that that's exactly what the National Bank of Ukraine is using right now. What about the right-hand side variables in that Taylor rule? Some researchers suggest, in addition to the two main variables that should enter the Taylor rule, such as inflation and the output gap or unemployment gap, to include the third variable. The third variable can be either the real exchange rate between the Ukrainian hryvnia and the US dollar, or it can be the US federal funds rate. Of course, if hryvnia enters the Taylor rule, it should enter with a negative coefficient, meaning that an appreciation of the hryvnia will call for lower interest rates. However, there is also a developed literature with two examples being Ball 1999 and Spencer 1999, who shows that this more complicated tail rule that has this extra variable in it does not perform better than the simple classical two-variable rule. So even the standard Taylor rule is expected to perform very well for the case of Ukraine, which is a small open economy. And to conclude, here's the points that we went over in this paper. First of all, if you look at empirical evidence, we can see that there is a clear trend towards using policy rules all over the world. Using a policy rule for the case of Ukraine might be really advantageous for the economy, because first of all, it will increase credibility of monetary policy, it will anchor inflation expectations, and it will encourage further investment in Ukraine. The NBU shouldn't mechanically just follow the rule. However, it's usually a good idea to refer to a rule each time the NBU changes its policy rate, and at times when the NBU has to deviate from the rule, those deviations would have to be explained. And finally, there is no need to invent the wheel. Very simple two-variable classical Taylor rule is expected to perform very well for the case of Ukraine, which is a small open economy. Thank you.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. So we have some time for questions. Mm-hmm.
Outstanding presentation, by the way. I do work for the Fed, so a small disclaimer. The question is my own, does not represent the questions of the Fed. So I noticed when you showed that the periods when there was a high discretionary gap, or whatever you called it, when the Fed used the discretion as opposed to the rule, one of these periods is the Great Recession. I would refuse to believe that our economy was doing poorly because the Fed used the discretion as opposed to the rule. There was a lot of soup that hit the fan during the Great Recession, and it was not caused by discretion versus a rule or anything. So how do you address the causality of any way? That's one question, and if you answer it, I might ask another one.
I'll do my best, Julia. There's actually a large body of research that show that one of the reasons why the United States and then the rest of the world went into the Great Recession is because the Fed kept interest rates too low for way too long. And if you try to plot the interest rate suggested by the Taylor rule, they would have been a lot higher from 2001 to 2006. So that deviation in interest rates from those suggested by the Taylor rule might be at least one of the factors that contributed to the Great Recession in the first place. And also these results hold even if we omit the Great Recession period. We conducted that as one of the robustness checks.
Thank you very much for very interesting and very actual for Ukraine presentation. Yeah, I would like to clarify a little bit. Why do you say that inflation targeting is not consistent with the policy law? Because usually inflation targeting is considered to be a little bit more flexible regime, yeah, but at the same time, usually it's called like constrained discretion, yeah. And also during your presentation, you mentioned some examples of the countries with the inflation targeting, not only with developed countries, but also with developing countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and so on. Mm-hmm. That's actually the first question, and I have another one. You also mentioned that the National Bank of Ukraine currently is using discretion regime in the discretion mode. Okay, I would not agree actually with such with such a decision, because frankly speaking, in our current policy, when we provide some recommendations during the MPC meeting to our bosses, so we also use different policy rules, show the trajectories of the policy instruments according to rules and the consequences of them. But I am not sure that we will find a lot of examples in practice where the central banks communicate their policy rules to the public very explicitly, yes, and explain the deviation from these rules. And for me, it looks a little, so in theory maybe it works, but there are too many technical issues, at least decision on output gap, especially in Ukrainian environment, very unstable environment, very difficult to provide very credible estimate and other issues.
Thank you for the question. I will be happy to address them. So your first question was about inflation targeting, why I don't agree that it can be called a rule. So suppose that the central bank indeed targets inflation. It means that each time inflation goes up, central bank has to raise the policy rate by more than 1-for-1 with the rise in inflation. Right. But that can be the coefficient of 1.5. It can be a coefficient of 2. It can be a coefficient of 7.5. All those would constitute different rules. All of them will be able to bring inflation down. But all of them are not equally important or equally successful. So policy rule is much stricter than just inflation targeting. It's a specific way of inflation targeting. There are many different paths that will eventually lead to stable inflation. When you specify a tail rule, you're picking one. There can be many that will still result in disinflation and bring inflation down. But a rule is picking one single path out of all options. About the National Bank of Ukraine not strictly using a rule. Of course, I mean, I have no doubt that the National Bank of Ukraine is using several different models to test their policy, and one of the models does include some rule as one of the building blocks. However, as far as I understand, not one single model, but several models are used. And in addition to that, probably expert opinions are used as well, right? So that combined, it doesn't constitute a strict policy rule. It's more like a set of guidelines. So a policy rule, again, would be a lot more precise. It's a very specific set of instructions that would not only address the question of what to do today, to also allow you to answer the question of what the National Bank of Ukraine will do if, for example, for some reason, inflation next year goes up back to 43%. So a rule will like set a plan of what to do in each particular circumstance. It can be just a set of instructions, or it can be a mathematical formula. But it not only tells what Ukraine is doing right now, but what the National Bank of Ukraine will do in each particular circumstance. And that's why it actually allows to anchor long-run expectations and makes monetary policy predictable. Because investors know that, okay, if this happens, this will be the policy rate. If this happens, this will be the policy rate.
Okay, maybe one more quick question. There are so many, so maybe let's make those questions quick, then we'll have some time for more.
A minor comment. It seems to me that a larger deviation observed in your estimation does not necessarily imply that the bank uses discretion. It might be simply a result of model misspecification. So central bank can use another policy rule. For example, they can use Taylor rule augmented with other variables or something different. So for me, maybe it's better to do not talk about the periods of discretion, but talk about just periods of deviation from the standard Taylor rule, because I think it's too strong statement.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with that. Each time I use the word discretion, I meant discretion with regard to the classical 1993 rule. I, of course, didn't mean that they haven't used like any rule imaginary, absolutely. It was just deviations from the one standard classical Taylor rule.
One more question.
Thank you for a nice report. I guess everybody aware here about old discussion, old tradition, what is central banking, more art or more science. And in that respect, rules are often criticized from that point of view that central banks should follow rules in good times but deviate from rules in bad times. So you show very nice example of Fed history and states with following rules and episodes of discretion, and it was very clear that episodes of discretions is also episode of crises and recessions. So my question, maybe comment is the next. After you compare the results using the misery index, loss functions, and quadratic loss functions, and also you got the results that on the side of rule following periods. So, but it is clear that in recession time, macroeconomic results are a priori worse. So, what you exactly compare? It's one question. And the next, you know that, for example, Ken Rogov proposed to include term of trade variable in reaction function, something like that. What do you think about reaction function for Ukraine, taking into account the high level of openness of Ukrainian economy and that export-import dynamics really affect on potential GDP in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I guess I'll first try to answer the last question and then I'll move back to the first question. With regard to Ukraine, I haven't personally conducted research in Ukrainian monetary policy, so unfortunately I'm not able to answer that question. What to do know is that for many small open economies, a simple Taylor rule works well. But I don't know how well it will work for the case of Ukraine. I personally haven't done my estimation, haven't done my work on that. About your previous question, of course, rules have disadvantages. If either rules or discretion only had advantages, we wouldn't have to make this choice. The choice would have been a lot clearer. We would just pick one over another. Second, each time you conduct any econometric exercise, of course, endogeneity and especially reverse causality is a big issue. We try to deal with that by assuming this policy lag. We try to assume that monetary policy acts with a lag, or we vary the lag between 4 quarters and 6 quarters. So we did try to separate in time the cause and effect. It doesn't completely solve the problem, but at least it addresses it partially.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so please.